just pure friendship with Marcus Anderson, because it seems that every which way they turn, Soho House's name comes.
Said it that from the moment Meghan Markle was signing that marriage certificate, she was already plotting her divorce. Meghan has been preparing. Make no mistake about that. She barely tolerated that guy. She's never told him she loved him. In that interview,
We wonder what on earth Harry thinks of all this. Is he quite happy that this relationship has been instilled in Meghan and Marcus?
Prince Harry realizes the romance he trusted was really a calculated assent, and now the marriage is collapsing toward an unavoidable divorce.
but not because she had any talent of her own. She's done with the fool. And the thing is that the reason why Meghan Markle has leaked...
Not 3 years. Not years of quiet resentment stacking up. Just 21 merciless, sleep-starved, paranoia-soaked days that shattered the illusion, days that pushed Prince Harry from clinging to a fairy tale ending to silently searching divorce attorneys at 3 a.m. The irony was suffocating. The man who once swore he fled the palace to reclaim his peace had never felt more imprisoned, locked inside his own thoughts, pacing a mental cage with no exit in sight.
I'm 100% certain, in my honest opinion, that they had planned this all from the start to hook a prince and make everything possible.
The moment Harry noticed the Soho House tote, there was no way to erase it from his mind. That was the cruelty of it. It wasn't explosive enough to qualify as a smoking gun, yet it spoke loudly enough to confirm a truth he hadn't wanted to face. Something had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The bag wasn't luxury. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed to pull focus. And that was exactly what made it unsettling. Because within Soho House culture, nothing is random. Nothing appears by accident. Especially not objects that slip into photographs passed quietly among the wealthy, the influential, and those positioned very deliberately where power circulates.
Prince wealthy enough with good connections. And hey ho, they did it. And it always seems with Meghan that everything comes back to Soho. It really is quite shocking when you look at it. How exactly...
Harry understood that world far better than people like to admit. He had grown up watching doors open and close based on surnames, proximity, and usefulness. And Soho House was one of those places that pretended to be casual while functioning like a velvet rope factory for ambition. You didn't just stumble into that ecosystem without someone vouching for you, guiding you, and quietly investing in your presence. That bag meant someone had opened the gate. And gates like that never open themselves.
In her head, there is no way in hell that she can conceive that she's not attractive. There is no way that...
Harry knew that ecosystem better than anyone cared to acknowledge. He was raised inside a system where access was currency, where doors swung open or slammed shut based on last names, proximity to power, and how useful you were to the right people at the right moment. And Soho House was exactly that kind of place, a space that sold effortlessness while operating like a velvet rope assembly line for ambition. You didn't wander into that orbit by accident. You didn't just end up there. Someone had to endorse you, shepherd you, quietly decide you were worth the investment. And that bag, small, unremarkable, almost invisible, signaled precisely that. It meant a gate had been unlocked. And Harry knew one thing for certain: gates like that don't open themselves.
Very question, is she on their payroll? Because she was their ambassador as such. She was always pictured there pre-Harry. They even went there on their first date. And
what unsettled Harry most was not the yacht or the trip or even the lifestyle, but the realization that this was not a random rich person vacation, but a Soho House environment, which meant curated guests, controlled access, and intentional overlaps. That bag represented a network, not a weekend. And networks existed to produce outcomes, not memories. For the first time, Harry allowed himself to ask a question he had spent years aggressively avoiding. How many of Meghan's chance encounters were actually engineered moments designed to move her closer to men with influence?
I want to sleep with her because that's how she got to where she is right now. She's used to using her body for what she wants. She's used to...
The more he sat with it, the more ridiculous his previous blind trust began to feel, because this wasn't about judging ambition, but about honesty. And suddenly, it seemed like he had married someone whose past had been edited for tone, not truth. The bag was a symbol of a world that operated quietly, efficiently, and without emotional attachment. And Harry, for all his privilege, had never imagined himself as a product of that machine. For years, Marcus Anderson had existed in Harry's mind as background decor. The kind of social accessory you barely register because everyone insists he's harmless, charming, and simply well-connected. Which in elite circles is usually code for someone you should absolutely be paying closer attention to. Harry had accepted the story presented to him without question, largely because Marcus was framed as Meghan's quirky Toronto friend, the stylish insider who loved a party and somehow always knew where the best ones were happening.
That she's being dumped. Now that she sees that she no longer has that hold on Harry, things have taken a turn for the worse. And Harry is in absolute panic.
That illusion disintegrated the moment Harry started digging beyond surface-level profiles and carefully scrubbed bios. What emerged instead was not a social butterfly, but a social architect. Someone whose influence wasn't loud because it didn't need to be. Marcus didn't chase visibility. He controlled it. Old society blogs, archived interviews, and half-deed articles painted a remarkably consistent picture of a man who did not attend events for enjoyment, but attended them for placement, positioning, and outcome. The language used to describe Marcus was never accidental. Connector appeared often, but so did terms like fixer, gatekeeper, and access broker. Words that don't belong to casual friendships, but to systems built around power exchange.
Greatest hits, and it's absolutely a nightmare. And a video, I've seen an alleged video that she has of him because she's been leaking some.
Marcus Anderson didn't float through elite spaces by accident. And he certainly didn't maintain relevance by being pleasant company. He functioned as infrastructure. The kind of person powerful circles rely on precisely because he operates quietly, never demanding credit, never appearing threatening, and never leaving fingerprints on the outcomes he helps create.
Harry in the bedroom, Harry allegedly angry. And if you think that Amber Heard was terrible, Amber Heard, recorded or took pictures of Johnny Depp when he was passed out.
Old images showed him lingering near investors, producers, philanthropists, and heirs, always with a small constellation of attractive, ambitious women orbiting nearby. Women whose careers would later experience sudden and inexplicable leaps. At first glance, it looked like networking. Viewed together, it looked like curation. What unsettled Harry most was how seamlessly Marcus had been woven into his own life without resistance. Front row seat at the royal wedding. Private conversations at supposedly casual gatherings, a familiarity that suggested entitlement, rather than invitation. Harry began to wonder how many moments he had mistaken for friendliness were actually quiet evaluations. How many smiles masked calculations he had never been meant to see.
What's coming for Harry? So why does Harry wake up a couple of days ago? Because Meghan Markle doesn't rest. This woman, the devil is never up.
The real shock, however, came when Harry recognized Meghan's role within that system. She hadn't been a passive beneficiary of Marcus' world. She had been an active participant who learned its rules, mastered its language, and moved through it with practiced ease. This wasn't a woman stumbling her way upward through luck and charm. This was someone trained to recognize opportunity, capitalize on timing, and present herself as exactly what the room required in that moment.
Sex simple. In her mind, the worst thing is gonna be being dumped, because that will shatter her sex skill.
That realization carried an uncomfortable implication. Terry struggled to process because it reframed the story of how he and Meghan met from romantic destiny into something far colder. If Marcus was known for positioning people rather than merely introducing them, then the idea that Meghan's path had crossed Harry's organically began to feel naive, almost embarrassingly so. It suggested intent where Harry had believed in fate.
That it confirms that she never carried the children. And I'm going to tell you why, guys, because this is terrible.
By the end of that night, Marcus Anderson was no longer a harmless footnote in Harry's marriage, but a central figure in a narrative that suddenly felt disturbingly deliberate. And once Harry accepted that Marcus had never been just a friend, he was forced to confront an even more unsettling question. If Marcus had been guiding Meghan's ascent for years, then Harry hadn't entered her life as a surprise. He had arrived exactly on schedule.
Meghan Markle goes exclusive. Prince Harry's sex shock. How?
By the time Harry picked up the phone that night, this was no longer curiosity dressed up as concern. This was dread finally admitting defeat and asking for confirmation. It was well past midnight, the kind of hour where people either confess or pretend they never happened. And Harry sat alone in the quiet house, acutely aware that ignorance was no longer protecting him. Meghan was asleep, blissfully unaware that the carefully curated version of her past was beginning to unravel one uncomfortable truth at a time.
Absolutely no difference in marriage to Meghan Markle, as they have barely been intimate since birth of second child.
The man Harry called wasn't random. He was a former Soho House insider, someone who had lived inside that ecosystem long enough to understand its rules and survived it long enough to stop romanticizing them. When Harry mentioned Marcus Anderson's name, the pause on the other end of the line was long enough to be deafening. The kind of silence that tells you the answer before it's spoken. No denial, no confusion, just a slow exhale, as if the man had been waiting years for someone to finally ask.
About you, but this does not bode well. This is really below the belt. She's really going for everything that
Once the romance collapsed under scrutiny, Harry did what the palace had trained him to do since childhood. He followed the money because money doesn't lie, embellish, or protect feelings, and it certainly doesn't care about love stories. Harry knew Meghan's acting salary down to the rough bracket because it had been discussed openly, defensively even, whenever questions about her lifestyle came up. At the time, he had accepted vague explanations and shrugged off inconsistencies as none of his business. That luxury disappeared the moment the numbers stopped adding up.
his virility. The thing is, though, that Meghan has some nerve because Meghan...
Flights across continents, 5-star hotels during peak season's yacht weeks that didn't come with budget options. Designer wardrobes refreshed with suspicious frequency. Professional hair, makeup, and styling that looked less like occasional indulgence and more like a permanent operating cost. Harry sat with a pen and paper and began calculating conservatively, deliberately underestimating where he could, and still arrived at a number that made his stomach turn. Roughly $7,000 a year, and that was being generous.
She has bald patches. Her forehead looks like a 747 Langdon strip. She's not one to talk.
That figure didn't include emergencies, last-minute changes, or the cost of maintaining appearances in rooms where looking underfunded was not an option. Harry knew her income could not sustain that lifestyle. Not consistently, not quietly, and certainly not without someone stepping in to bridge the gap. Love might excuse financial blind spots, but arithmetic does not. News.
Battle against baldness has taken a very intimate turn, with friends claiming the Duke of Sussex's use of hair loss medication has led.
When Harry contacted a current Soho House Toronto connection, the conversation was careful, measured, and dripping with reluctance. The answer, when it finally came, landed with brutal clarity. Meghan's membership hadn't been discounted or partially covered. It had been fully comped for 5 years. No invoices, no reminders, no questions, sponsored access, quietly approved.
She has to be the one who leaks that. So let's continue because it gets worse. And we're going to get to the part about the children. As radar...
When Harry asked who paid, the response was evasive but revealing because the man didn't say no one. He said Marcus had ways. Corporate accounts, anonymous approvals, strategic investments in potential. Suddenly, Meghan's rise no longer looked aspirational. It looked underwritten.
The 41-year-old is said to be relying on a cocktail of finance.
Harry understood then that someone had been funding the climb, not out of charity, but expectation. And once he saw the financial trail, he couldn't unsee it. This wasn't a love-meeting opportunity. This was an opportunity preparing for its payoff. And Harry realized far too late that he might have been the most expensive return on investment of all.
Minoxidil to slow his hair loss, even as those close to him say the side effects are a price he's not worried about paying.
When Harry finally pulled the wedding guest list from the drawer where it had been quietly collecting dust, he did so with the sinking feeling of a man who already knows the answer but needs to see it in ink to make the pain official. The list was immaculate, categorized, color-coded, and approved by teams on both sides. Yet, Harry had never truly examined Meghan's side before because love at the time had made scrutiny feel unnecessary and even cruel. Now, with affection replaced by suspicion, every name read like a clue instead of a compliment.
Cocktail, a very particular specific cocktail for hair loss. So, because there are all tons of treatments that people can have for the hair. Rogaine, I heard that's a very...
What Harry found was not a group of organic relationships, but a carefully assembled network. Marcus Anderson sat comfortably in the front row, not as a distant acquaintance, but as someone whose presence was non-negotiable. Surrounding him were Soho House executives, longtime regulars, facilitators, and power-adjacent figures, who had been photographed with Meghan years before Harry ever entered her orbit. These weren't childhood friends who'd known her before ambition set in, nor were they colleagues from acting gigs or casual acquaintances from her early career. They were infrastructure.
Cabinet would know. That, I mean, come on. The only people who would have access to that kind of specific medical information would be the doctor prescribing that, or your wife at home who has access to
Harry began highlighting names, then cross-referencing them with photos, events, and timelines. And the pattern became grotesquely clear. Out of roughly 200 guests attributed to Meghan's side, more than 60 had direct ties to Soho House or to Marcus' curated world. This wasn't coincidence or overlap. It was concentration. It looked less like a wedding guest list and more like a conference roster, a summit celebrating the successful culmination of a long-term project.
Sexually, then also that would be your wife and yourself. I don't see him.
The moment that broke whatever denial Harry had left came when he stumbled across a reception photo he'd seen dozens of times without really looking. Marcus stood with several Soho House executives, champagne glasses raised, smiling with the relaxed confidence of men who believed their work was complete. They didn't look like guests celebrating love. They looked like stakeholders celebrating a win.
A source of insecurity, once known for his full flame-colored locks, the Duke has been
That realization was devastating because it reframed the most important day of Harry's life as something transactional rather than intimate. His wedding hadn't been the merging of two families. It had been a victory lap for a system that had successfully delivered its most ambitious outcome. Harry hadn't just married Meghan. He had unknowingly validated a network that had been building toward him for years.
He's said to have turned to pharmaceutical treatments to hold on to what remains. That is so nasty.
The voicemail archive was a place Harry had avoided for years, largely because it represented a version of himself he no longer wanted to confront, one where he had chosen defiance over discernment and passion over caution. Late one night, exhausted and emotionally numb, Harry scrolled through old messages with shaking hands, telling himself he was only looking for clarity, not absolution. What he found instead was regret preserved perfectly in digital form.
And sexual dysfunction. I mean, a source, also known as Rachel Meghan Markle, claimed to read her online.
There it was, dated November 2017, a voicemail from William that Harry remembered deleting without listening because anger had been easier than reflection at the time. When he pressed play, William's voice filled the room, calm, but urgent, stripped of rivalry, and thick with concern. He spoke not as an heir, but as a brother who had access to information Harry didn't want to hear.
Those side effects, but the truth is, it doesn't really matter to him anymore. Friends say there's been little intimacy between him and Meghan for a long time, since the birth of their child.
William explained, had flagged Meghan's extensive involvement in Soho House circles long before the engagement. Marcus Anderson's reputation wasn't gossip. It was documented. Meghan had been photographed repeatedly at events tied to Harry's donors and charities years before they officially met. This isn't random, William had said, his voice steady and pleading. Please look into this before you propose.
Or co-parents than a couple. Smack my butt. Oh my dear Lord. The insider added, also known as Rachel Meghan Markle, he's joked before about not one.
Harry replayed the message, then played it again, and then a third time. Each repetition dismantling another layer of resentment he had used to shield himself from reality. William hadn't been jealous or controlling. He had been informed. Additional voicemails followed, each one reinforcing the same warning. Each one ignored by Harry, who believed love meant loyalty at all costs.
Trading off his manhood for vanity, but at this point, it's about control. His appearance is one of the few things he still feels he can manage. This is game over.
The most painful realization wasn't that William had been right, but that Harry had actively chosen not to listen, because acknowledging the warning would have required slowing down a romance he was desperate to believe in. He had mistaken caution for cruelty and information for interference. In doing so, he hadn't just shut out palace advice. He had shut out the one person who understood the cost of ignoring uncomfortable truths.
Because I know a lot of people are saying that Harry and Meghan are playing a game and that he's in on it. Please, all of you people.
Now alone with those messages echoing in his head, Harry understood that the collapse of his marriage didn't begin with scandal or exposure, but with a voicemail he never wanted to hear from a brother who had tried to save him from exactly this outcome. By the time Harry reached the stage, the marriage wasn't unraveling loudly or dramatically. It was rotting quietly, which somehow felt cruel. Nights stretched endlessly, not because of arguments or slammed doors, but because Harry simply could not turn his mind off. Sleep became a distant rumor, something other people enjoyed while he lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying 10 years of memories with a new merciless filter applied to every moment. Each recollection that once felt spontaneous now carried the faint stench of rehearsal.
the makeup artist, he plugged Soho's crockery on his Instagram while implying that he was with Meghan, best buds, the avocado with
Meghan noticed the changes, of course, but misread them in ways that now felt almost insulting. She blamed stress, pressure, and media fatigue, delivering sympathetic lines about how hard everything had become. While Harry nodded along, fully aware that what was breaking him had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with hindsight. He stopped eating properly, claiming busy schedules, and stopped touching her altogether, citing exhaustion, because physical closeness felt dishonest when his mind was screaming questions he didn't yet know how to ask. The worst part wasn't anger or betrayal, but the creeping fear that settled in his chest whenever he allowed himself to think too deeply. If so much of Meghan's past had been curated, guided, and quietly financed, then what exactly had he married? A woman or a role perfected over years of strategic exposure? That question haunted him because it stripped their relationship of emotional safety. Love, he realized, cannot survive uncertainty about intent.
What her connection to Soho House, because everything comes back. There has got to be more to this other than just pure friendship with Marcus Anderson, because it seemed...
By the end of those sleepless weeks, Harry wasn't just tired. He was hollowed out. The boy who had spent his life feeling unwanted now faced a different terror entirely. The possibility that he had been wanted only for what he represented, not for who he was. That thought followed him into every room, every silence, every shared glance until the marriage felt less like a partnership and more like an unresolved investigation he could no longer escape. The moment love turned into fear was subtle enough that Harry almost missed it, which made it even more unsettling. It wasn't sparked by a single argument or a revelation, but by the quiet realization that trust had evaporated without ceremony, leaving behind a relationship that suddenly felt unsafe rather than comforting. Harry began asking himself questions he never imagined needing to ask about his own wife. And the fact that those questions felt necessary terrified him more than any answer ever could.
Soho House's name comes up. And that to me is very, very worrying. This is an elite...
What frightened him most wasn't the past itself, but what the past implied about the future. If their meeting had been engineered, if access had been guided and proximity curated, then what else in his life had been quietly shaped without his consent? Had public narratives been built around him the same way social opportunities had been built around her? Had moments he believed were private victories actually been calculated steps in a broader strategy? These thoughts arrived uninvited and refused to leave. Harry began documenting everything not out of malice but instinct. The same instinct palace life had drilled into him from childhood. He took notes, saved articles, referenced timelines, and quietly consulted professionals without attaching names or emotions to the conversations. This wasn't rage or revenge. It was self-defense. For the first time, Harry treated his marriage the way he had been taught to treat threats, with caution, distance, and verification.
I doubt it very, very much. And then you've got to wonder, is this compensating both Marcus Anderson and Soho House for getting her?
The shift was irreversible. Love relies on vulnerability, but fear demands protection. And Harry could feel himself choosing the latter, even when he didn't want to. Meghan sensed the emotional withdrawal, but seemed unable or unwilling to grasp its source, offering reassurance instead of transparency, comfort instead of clarity. To Harry, that only deepened the divide because reassurance without honesty felt manipulative rather than loving. By the time he admitted to himself that he was afraid of the person he had married, the decision was already forming beneath the surface. Marriages don't survive fear, especially when that fear is rooted in the belief that your role in someone else's life may have been planned long before love ever entered the equation. And once Harry crossed that line, there was no way back to the version of the relationship that had once felt real.
And dominating the whole of society. Everybody knows her name in the world, Meghan Markle.
That morning, Harry understood that the marriage wasn't struggling. It was already over emotionally, sustained only by habit and optics. Love hadn't exploded. It had evaporated, leaving behind a quiet, humiliating emptiness that finally forced Harry to admit the truth he had been avoiding. Whatever this relationship had been, it was no longer real, and pretending otherwise was beginning to feel like self-betrayal. Contrary to public assumptions, Harry's decision to leave was not impulsive, emotional, or fueled by rage, which almost made it more devastating because it meant the choice was rational, measured, and irreversible. This wasn't a man storming out in anger. It was a man calmly stepping away from something he no longer recognized as safe. Harry had spent his entire life being told to think before he acted, and for once he followed that advice to the letter.
Talked about woman in the world right now, rightly or wrongly, good or bad press, she's still up there. And it has been said multiple times.
He didn't announce anything. He didn't threaten. He didn't confide in friends who might leak. Instead, he did what palace training had ingrained in him since childhood. He gathered information quietly and prepared for outcomes rather than reactions. Legal consultations happened discreetly, framed as hypotheticals, stripped of emotion, and conducted with professionals who understood the value of silence. The word divorce entered the conversation long before it entered Harry's heart, which was already grieving something else entirely. What solidified his resolve wasn't a single new discovery, but the accumulation of everything he had already learned. The Soho House connections, the financial discrepancies, the curated introductions, the ignored warnings, each piece on its own could be explained away. But together, they formed a narrative that made staying feel reckless rather than loyal. Harry realized that continuing the marriage out of fear of backlash would mean sacrificing the last shred of autonomy he had left.
Left this recent trip to the UK and fled quickly back to Canada. How toxic, she said, Britain were. And
there was also a quieter, more uncomfortable motivation driving him forward, which was the recognition that staying would require him to keep lying to himself. He would have to accept reassurances instead of answers, affection instead of accountability, and optics instead of truth. For someone who had spent years claiming he wanted authenticity, that hypocrisy felt unbearable. Harry didn't frame the decision as abandonment. He framed it as survival. The idea of growing old inside a relationship that felt engineered rather than organic terrified him more than public scrutiny ever could. He had already lost too much trying to protect a story that no longer held up under examination. By the time he internally committed to leaving, there was no drama left in him. Only clarity, and clarity, unlike anger, does not fade with time.
You're setting up office and you obviously need us because otherwise you would have literally turned, run and never even cared about the UK ever again. But that's not all.
When Harry finally initiated the divorce process, it wasn't accompanied by theatrics, leaks, or emotional ultimatums, which made it all the more shocking to those who assumed everything in his life required spectacle. This wasn't a reaction. It was an execution of a decision already made. Paperwork moved quietly. Advisors were informed selectively. Boundaries were established without fanfare. Harry approached the process like someone who had learned painfully what happens when you ignore red flags and outsource your instincts. Those close to the situation described the initiation as methodical to the point of being chilling. Because Harry was no longer operating from heartbreak, but from resolution. He had receipts, timelines, and documentation, not for revenge, but for clarity. This wasn't about punishing Meghan. It was about protecting himself from further manipulation, intentional or otherwise. For a man long accused of being emotionally impulsive, the restraint was almost unrecognizable.
Your side, because that's where the pennies come from at the moment, doesn't it? I believe that they are toxic.
What surprised observers most was how little negotiation Harry seemed willing to entertain around the core issue, which was trust. Money could be discussed, logistics could be managed, public messaging could be coordinated, but the emotional breach was non-negotiable. Harry had reached a point where explanations no longer mattered because the context had already rewritten everything. The initiation marked a turning point, not just in the marriage, but in Harry's self-perception. For the first time, he wasn't reacting against family, institutions, or public opinion. He was acting for himself. Quietly reclaiming agency he hadn't realized he'd surrendered years earlier. The irony was brutal. The man who fled the monarchy to escape control had discovered it inside his own marriage. Those who expected fireworks were disappointed. There were no public statements dripping with emotion, no dramatic interviews framing himself as the victim. Harry understood now how narratives worked, and he refused to feed the machine that had already cost him so much. The divorce wasn't initiated to make noise. It was initiated to end it.
Work with them. Perhaps the big banks, the big companies, will get them to speak.
If Harry's initiation of divorce was quiet, Meghan's reaction was anything but internally contained, even if it remained externally polished. According to insiders, she genuinely did not believe Harry would ever leave, which speaks volumes about how differently they understood the marriage by the end. She knew things were strained, of course, but she believed strain was manageable, especially with the right messaging, the right reassurance, and the right public alignment. What she reportedly underestimated was how deeply the Soho House revelations had cut, not because of their scandal potential, but because of what they implied about intent. Meghan framed the situation as misunderstanding layered on media distortion, offering explanations without ever fully addressing the structural questions Harry couldn't stop asking. Her instinct was to smooth, soften, and redirect. Strategies that had served her well in public life, but fell flat in a private reckoning.
I mean, that's what you do, wouldn't you? Think, well, hey, for $1 million, we'll go and get Harry and Meghan. Let's see what they've got to say. But you can...
That year the shock wasn't just that Harry had initiated divorce, but that he did so without seeking her validation or permission, which disrupted a dynamic where she had grown accustomed to being the emotional center of the relationship. For perhaps the first time, Harry was not asking to be reassured or convinced. He was informing. Denial followed swiftly, not loud or dramatic, but strategic. Meghan leaned into public unity, careful language, and sympathetic narratives about pressure and misunderstanding, likely assuming time would soften Harry's resolve. What she failed to grasp was that Harry wasn't angry enough to be persuaded. He was tired enough to be done.
Is unsustainable.
The gap between them widened further as Meghan attempted to negotiate emotion while Harry focused on structure. Where she sought conversation, he sought boundaries. Where she sought reassurance, he sought closure. The mismatch made reconciliation impossible. Not because of hostility, but because they were no longer speaking the same language.
Tank. They will find that the grass is not greener on the other side. They are looking, apparently, more concentrated to the California area to move.
What stung most according to those close to Harry was the sense that even now honesty was being rationed, delivered only in amounts deemed safe. That confirmed his worst fear, which was that transparency was always conditional. And once Harry recognized that pattern, the shock on Meghan's side became irrelevant because he had already accepted that understanding would never come freely. The divorce then wasn't just an ending, but a reclamation. Harry chose himself not out of pride, but necessity. He chose autonomy over performance, clarity over comfort, and solitude over strategic affection. The nightmare wasn't that he had been targeted. The nightmare was realizing it too late. And this time, instead of running from the truth, Harry finally let it guide him out.
While the current President Trump, was in office. Well, that looks like it's going to change because they are